History has a way of polishing its heroes until they shine like marble statues. The founding fathers, in particular, are often remembered in bronze and stone, stalwart, wise, men of reason who built a nation out of rebellion in parchment. But history, if you lean close enough, whispers secrets that the marble cannot hide. And at the quiet heart of one of America's greatest figures, Thomas Jefferson, was a story so uncomfortable, so paradoxical, that it was buried, denied, and ridiculed for generations. It is the story of a president who fell in love with his slave. The name Sally Hemings lingers like a shadow in Jefferson's legacy. For decades, she was mentioned in half sentences, in hushed tones, or in footnotes, as though her existence was an inconvenient rumor rather than part of the man's life. Yet Sally was no ghost. She was flesh and blood, born into slavery in Virginia in 1773, owned by Jefferson's father-in-law, and later inherited into Jefferson's household. She was a half-sister to Jefferson's own wife, Martha Wales, through Martha's father's relationship with an enslaved woman, which meant that when Jefferson married Martha, he also inherited Sally, a teenager bound to him not just by law, but by bloodlines that tangled the categories of family, slavery, and intimacy. For many years, Jefferson's story was told without her. The author of the Declaration of Independence, governor of Virginia, ambassador to France, secretary of state, vice president, president of the United States. He was the man who wrote that all men are created equal, the philosopher-president who dreamed of liberty. Yet at Monticello, his grand hilltop estate, liberty was a selective privilege. Hemings, like hundreds of others, lived in bondage, her life dictated by the man who proclaimed freedom for a nation.
The scandal of their relationship would not break publicly until 1802, when journalist James Callender, a bitter political enemy of Jefferson, accused him of keeping a slave mistress and fathering children with her. Callender's accusations were printed in newspapers, spreading across the young republic like wildfire. Jefferson's supporters denied it, his enemies jeered, and the nation wrestled with an image of its third president that was far less tidy than the one carved into textbooks. But long before the rumors hit the press, the relationship had already taken root. It began, as far as history can trace, in Paris. In 1787, Jefferson was serving as America's minister to France. He brought with him his daughter, Martha, known as Patsy, and later arranged for Sally Hemings, then only 14, to accompany Jefferson's younger daughter, Maria. Paris was not Virginia. Under French law, slavery was technically illegal, and many enslaved people who found themselves in France sought their freedom. Sally, though still very young, must have known this. Yet she remained with Jefferson in a world of salons, French tutors, and revolutionary ferment. It was in this foreign city, far from Monticello's red clay, that their relationship is believed to have begun. When Jefferson prepared to return to Virginia in 1789, Sally faced a choice, perhaps the first true choice of her life. Accounts passed down through her descendants say that she refused to go back unless Jefferson made a promise, that her children would be freed. Whether this negotiation took place exactly as told is impossible to prove, but what matters is that her family believed it, and historians now consider it plausible. Sally returned to Virginia with Jefferson, and from then on, she lived in a peculiar in-between space, not a wife, not legally recognized, yet not simply another enslaved worker. She bore at least 6 children by Jefferson, 4 of whom survived into adulthood. To the neighbors and visitors at Monticello, whispers stirred. A young enslaved woman who bore children that resembled the master was not easily ignored. Yet in Jefferson's lifetime, the topic remained carefully managed. He never acknowledged the relationship publicly, his family denied it, his political allies dismissed it as slander. But for those who lived at Monticello, the truth was an open secret. This is where the paradox becomes most painful. Jefferson, who penned words about natural rights and freedom, simultaneously held in bondage the woman with whom he shared his most intimate bond. Their relationship was shaped by affection, yes, but also by power, an imbalance so deep that historians still debate how to describe it. Was it love? Was it coercion? Could it be both, tangled in a system where consent was never truly possible? What is certain is that the relationship existed, endured, and left descendants who carry Jefferson's blood into the present day. In the 20th century, DNA testing confirmed what the rumors and family stories had long suggested. Thomas Jefferson fathered Sally Hemings' children. The marble statue cracked, and the whisper became fact. And so when we look up at Monticello's dome against the Virginia sky, we are reminded that history is not clean. It is not marble, it is messy, contradictory, and human. the man who wrote of liberty, loved a woman who was never free. And their story, whispered in shadows for centuries, is not simply scandal. It is a window into the entanglement of love, power, race, and nation at the very heart of America's beginning.
Life at Monticello was not merely the story of a grand house on a hill overlooking the rolling Virginian countryside. It was also the story of two parallel worlds, one gilded and one shadowed. Visitors who climbed the mountain road to Jefferson's estate saw the polished version, classical columns, French-inspired gardens, a library that never seemed to run out of books, and an owner who could quote Cicero as easily as he could discuss crop rotation. Yet beneath that varnished exterior, another world existed, hidden in the folds of the mountain, a community of enslaved people whose lives were the foundation upon which Jefferson's refinement was built. It was in this shadowed world that Sally Hemings lived. She had been brought to Monticello as a child, part of the Hemings family. Remarkably, a large, extended network of enslaved people who were also related, by blood, to Jefferson's late wife, Martha. That tangled web meant that Sally was not just another servant in the household. She was, in a very uncomfortable sense, a mirror of Jefferson's own family tree. Visitors might never have guessed it, but in the slave quarters, whispers carried a truth that the main house preferred to overlook. Sally was described by those who saw her as beautiful, fair-skinned, with straight hair and features that reflected her mixed ancestry. She was not a shadow at the edge of the plantation, but a striking presence. When Jefferson took her with him to Paris in the 1780s, she was still a teenager. France, unlike Virginia, offered her a glimpse of freedom, for the laws there did not recognize slavery in the same way. Imagine the irony. Jefferson, who wrote the immortal words that all men are created equal, lived in a nation where the young woman standing beside him could have claimed her liberty. And yet, when the moment came, Sally did not leave him. The reasons for that decision were, and remain, complicated. Jefferson promised her extraordinary privileges, even for one in bondage. And perhaps at 17, far from home, facing the weight of unfamiliar choices, Sally chose what seemed to her the safer path. But in that choice lay the beginning of a relationship that would define both of their lives. One part silence, one part scandal, and one part something far harder to categorize. At Monticello, the relationship was never openly acknowledged. To guests, Jefferson remained the widower scholar, a man of books and ideas. To the enslaved community, however, the truth was less disguised. They saw the comings and goings, the unspoken arrangements, the children who bore his likeness. They knew that power and intimacy were hopelessly entangled in this story. In their world, there were no myths to protect the sage of Monticello. This, then, was the contradiction at the heart of early America. A man who preached liberty but held people in bondage. A man celebrated for reason but guided by desires he could not make public. And at the center of that contradiction stood Sally Hemings, whose life forced uncomfortable questions that history itself has struggled to answer.
For years, the story of Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings was whispered more than spoken. At Monticello, it was not written in letters or etched into stone, but visible in the faces of children. They appeared one by one, light-skinned, resembling not the enslaved men of the mountain, but the master himself. To guests, they might have seemed like coincidence. To the enslaved community, they were proof of something that everyone knew, but few dared to speak aloud. The children were given work, but not in the fields. They were trained as artisans, musicians, domestic servants, roles closer to the main house, where Jefferson could keep watch over them. In this, there was both privilege and burden. They were spared the hardest labour, yet their very presence was a reminder of the blurred line between the world of the enslaved and the world of the master. They carried Jefferson's blood, but not his name, his features, but not his status. Sally's children grew up in a strange limbo. They were neither fully free nor fully bound, hovering in a space where affection and authority collided. Jefferson never publicly acknowledged them, but he made quiet arrangements that spoke volumes. Some were allowed to walk away from Monticello as young adults, given unofficial freedom in a system that otherwise denied them the right to exist as equals. One son, Madison Hemings, would later record these contradictions with remarkable clarity, describing the complicated relationship between his mother and the man who owned her. Outside the mountain, whispers grew louder. Neighbours noticed the resemblance between Jefferson and the Hemings children. Visitors left Monticello with questions, passing along stories that mixed fact with rumour. By the early 19th century, newspapers had begun to pick at the tale, suggesting that the man who drafted America's grandest promises had a secret family he dared not claim. Jefferson, for his part, remained silent. He never denied the charges, never wrote a line to clear his name, and in that silence, the scandal only deepened. For the children themselves, survival meant walking a careful line. Some passed into white society, blending so completely that their descendants would never know their true origins. Others carried the Hemings name proudly, preserving the memory of a mother who endured the contradictions of bondage with a quiet strength. In their lives, we see the echo of a truth America itself wrestled with, that freedom and slavery, love and power, family and silence could all coexist uneasily under the same roof. And so the mountain kept its secret, hidden in plain sight. The guests saw a statesman, the enslaved saw a father. History would eventually force both images into the light.
By the year 1802, the quiet whispers of Monticello no longer stayed confined to the mountain. They spilled into the streets of Washington, printed in ink that could not be ignored. A fiery journalist named James Callender, who once sought Jefferson's favor but found himself spurned, decided to reveal what others had only guessed. In the columns of the Richmond Recorder, he accused the president of keeping a woman in bondage as his concubine and fathering her children. For Jefferson's political enemies, it was a gift. Federalists, who loathed him already for his radical talk of democracy, seized upon the scandal with delight. They portrayed him not just as a hypocrite, but as a man who could not govern his own household, let alone a republic. The accusations were salacious, the imagery sharp, the outrage carefully stoked. To call a sitting president the father of enslaved children was more than an insult. It was an attempt to dismantle his credibility piece by piece. And yet, Jefferson did not answer. No letter to the editor, no fiery rebuttal, no courtroom challenge. He retreated into silence, allowing others to speak for him or against him. His allies dismissed the reports as lies, the twisted inventions of a bitter man. His critics insisted the truth was plain to see in the faces of the Hemings children. The nation, caught between, looked on with a mix of fascination and disgust. But the scandal was not merely about Jefferson's private life. It struck at the very heart of America's contradictions. How could the author of the Declaration of Independence, the man who proclaimed that all men are created equal, live in a household where freedom and bondage were divided by skin, and where affection crossed that line under cover of night? His story forced the young republic to confront questions it was not ready to answer, about race, about power, about whether liberty truly meant what the parchment claimed. Callender himself would not live long enough to see the lasting impact of his accusations, but his words outlived him, echoing through taverns and drawing rooms, through campaign speeches and dinner-table gossip. Even as Jefferson won re-election, the whispers never stopped. The tale of Sally Hemings and her children clung to him, a shadow at the edge of his statesmanship, a reminder that the private and the political could never be neatly separated. For some Americans, the scandal confirmed every suspicion they held about Jefferson's hypocrisy. For others, it was an uncomfortable truth better left unspoken. And for the enslaved people of Monticello, it was simply life, lived under the roof of a man who could be at once a master, a father, a lover, and a ghost in the pages of his own story.
As the years passed, Jefferson's relationship with the Hemings family revealed itself in quiet gestures that did not look like love in the ordinary sense, but also not like the cruelty that defines so much of slavery. He treated Sally Hemings and her children differently, not as equals, never that, but with a peculiar kind of care that set them apart from the rest of Monticello's enslaved community. Visitors noticed. The Hemings children, light-skinned and reserved, often worked inside the house rather than in the fields. They wore finer clothes than other enslaved boys and girls. They were trained in trades, carpentry, cooking, even music, skills that gave them dignity and opportunity far beyond what most enslaved children could hope for. Jefferson rarely wrote about them, never acknowledged paternity in ink, yet his actions spoke louder than silence. When 2 of Sally's sons came of age, Jefferson quietly allowed them to slip away into freedom. There were no advertisements placed in newspapers, no hounds sent in pursuit.
Instead, he looked the other way, giving them a chance to build lives of their own outside Monticello. Such leniency was almost unheard of for a man who meticulously recorded every hog slaughtered, every nail forged, every penny earned. Jefferson tracked all things, except, it seemed, the departure of Sally's children. And then there was Sally herself. Though she remained enslaved in name, she was never sold, never beaten, never cast into the fields. Her life was bound to Jefferson's house and Jefferson's will, but it carried privileges within the narrow confines of bondage. She raised her children in a strange middle ground, not free, but not fully enslaved either. The household understood, though few dared say it aloud, this arrangement was unlike any other. What was Jefferson's reasoning? Love? Guilt? A pragmatic attempt to keep his private life from unraveling in public? Historians still argue, but Monticello bore the evidence in every corner. The Hemings children grew up in plain sight, their features echoing the man in the big house. The staff whispered, the neighbours speculated, and Jefferson, for all his cleverness with words, offered none to explain the paradox. By the end of his life, he ensured that Sally's surviving children would be free. Some were quietly manumitted, others were simply allowed to walk away, never chased, never reclaimed. For a man who freed so few enslaved people outright, it was a remarkable exception. And yet, even here, contradiction lingered. Sally herself was not legally freed, though her children were. She lived out her final years in a grey space, technically enslaved, practically untouchable, her status dependent on the memory of a man who had died in debt. It is easy to mistake these gestures for kindness, but they were never equality. Jefferson did not overturn the system that gave him power over Sally Hemings. He simply bent it in ways that served his private needs. Still, those small bends mattered. They carved out a different path for Sally's children, and in doing so, they kept the story alive, a story that revealed as much about Jefferson as about the women history once tried to erase.
When Thomas Jefferson died on July 4, 1826, the 50th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, Monticello was a house heavy with debts, secrets, and questions about what would come next. His passing did not just mark the end of a statesman's life, it marked the unraveling of a household that had always rested on fragile contradictions. For Sally Hemings, the years that followed brought a strange kind of freedom. She was never formally freed in Jefferson's will. Her name did not appear in the neat lines of legal documents that released a few others from bondage. And yet, by silent agreement, she was allowed to live as a free woman. Jefferson's daughter, Martha Jefferson Randolph, permitted Sally to leave Monticello and reside in Charlottesville, where she lived out her remaining years in relative quiet. It was not freedom granted by law, but by custom and memory, the lingering power of her connection to Jefferson. Her children, though, fared differently. Madison and Eston Hemings were both freed outright. Madison would later tell his story to an Ohio newspaper, offering one of the first-hand accounts of his mother's relationship with Jefferson. Eston, light-skinned and musically gifted, reinvented himself in the North. In Ohio, he lived as a free man of color. Later, when the weight of prejudice grew too heavy, he moved to Wisconsin and began a new life, this time as a white man, passing into a society that would accept him only under a different identity. Sally's descendants carried the Jefferson bloodline into the 19th century, but often under assumed names, changed communities, and unspoken histories. Some clung to their story, insisting that Jefferson had been their father. Others denied it, folding themselves into anonymity for survival. For generations, their voices were brushed aside by historians unwilling to stain Jefferson's reputation with scandal. Meanwhile, Monticello itself began to crumble. Jefferson's heirs sold off land, furniture, and enslaved people to cover debts. The great house stood as a ruin of contradictions, a temple to liberty built on slavery, a monument to reason filled with silences, and, in its shadows, the memory of a woman who had shaped its story more than most dared admit. Sally Hemings died in 1835, in her early 60s. She left behind children, grandchildren, and a legacy that refused to be erased. Her story, once a whisper in hallways and taverns, had begun to print into print, passed down in clippings, rumors, and testimonies. Jefferson himself never confessed, but the lives of her children stood as a living record, walking proof of the entanglement he tried so hard to keep hidden. By the time the Civil War erupted a generation later, the Hemings family had scattered, some fighting for the Union, some building trades in northern towns, others disappearing into white society. But whether they claimed Jefferson as their father or not, his shadow followed them. The story of Sally Hemings was not just her own. It became a story about America itself,
about the fault lines between freedom and slavery, equality and power, love and exploitation. And as the 19th century wore on, it grew harder to pretend that Sally's life had not mattered, or that her bond with Jefferson had not left a mark on the nation's history. She was no longer just a figure in Jefferson's household, she was a figure in America's uneasy reckoning with its past.
For most of the 19th and early 20th centuries, the story of Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings lived in a strange half-light, too widely whispered to disappear, too scandalous to fully acknowledge. Neighbors had talked about it. Visitors to Monticello had noted the striking resemblance between Jefferson and the Hemings children. But in polite society, especially among Jefferson's descendants and admirers, the tale was treated as rumor, something to be dismissed, denied, or buried. In 1802, a journalist named James Callender had first published accusations that Jefferson kept a concubine at Monticello. Federalists, eager to smear the third president, seized on the charge, while Jefferson supporters scoffed at it as political slander. But the accusation lingered, hanging over his reputation like an unwelcome ghost. Even decades later, Callender's words remained the foundation of most public knowledge about the affair. Scandal printed in ink, but never fully proven. Jefferson's white descendants went to great lengths to deny the story. They argued that the Hemings children belonged not to Jefferson, but to other male relatives, most often his nephew Peter Carr. They clung to this defense for generations, insisting that their patriarch, the author of Liberty, could never have lived in such contradiction. In their minds, Jefferson's reputation was not only personal, but national. To admit that he had loved, or at least fathered children with, an enslaved woman would shatter the image of Jefferson as a flawless founder. Meanwhile, Sally's descendants told a different story. Madison Hemings, in an 1873 newspaper interview, plainly stated that Jefferson was his father. His testimony, detailed and unwavering, became one of the most important pieces of evidence in the historical record. For the Hemings family, this was not rumor, but memory, not scandal, but truth carried across generations. Historians, however, often sided with Jefferson's defenders. For much of the 20th century, scholarly works dismissed Sally Hemings as a footnote, a shadow in Jefferson's orbit rather than a central figure. Some writers cast her as little more than a servant, others as an invention of gossip. The weight of academic authority pushed her into obscurity, and for decades, Jefferson's public image remained largely untouched. But the debate refused to die. By the late 19th century, as America began confronting its racial past more openly, the Hemings story returned to the spotlight. In 1998, a groundbreaking DNA study revealed a genetic link between the Jefferson male line and the Hemings descendants, evidence that could no longer be brushed aside. Suddenly, what had once been dismissed as rumor gained scientific backing. The results did not end the debate, but they shifted it forever. Historians who had long denied the relationship were forced to reconsider. Museums at Monticello began acknowledging Sally Hemings as a central figure in the estate's history. Her story, once whispered in taverns and printed as political scandal, now stood in plaques, tours, and exhibits for the world to see. Yet the questions remain complicated. Was their relationship of love, coercion, or something that blurred the line between the two? Could a bond formed within the structures of slavery ever truly be called voluntary? These are questions without easy answers, questions that force us to grapple not only with Jefferson's contradictions but with America's. What is certain is that the story of Sally Hemings and Thomas Jefferson refuses to fade. It survives because it speaks to the core of the nation's struggle, the tension between its ideals and its realities, its dreams of liberty and its chains of bondage. And in that way, the scandal Callender once used to smear Jefferson has become something larger, a reminder that history is never neat and that even its heroes live with shadows.
By the early 21st century, the story of Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings was no longer tucked away in dusty archives or whispered as rumor. It stood at the heart of national conversations about race, memory, and the contradictions of America's founding. What had once been scandal became history, what had once been denied became acknowledged, and what had once been silenced finally began to find its voice. At Monticello, the transformation was especially striking. For decades, tours of Jefferson's estate focused on architecture, books, and statesmanship. Guides spoke of his genius, his gardens, his inventions. The Hemings family, if mentioned at all, was treated as background noise, a shadow behind Jefferson's brilliance. But by the 2000s, that silence began to crack. Today, Monticello tells a different story. visitors walk through exhibits that feature Sally Hemings as a central figure, not a footnote. Her name is spoken aloud in the very halls where she once walked in enforced quiet. For Sally's descendants, this recognition carries deep meaning. Families who for generations were dismissed as imposters or liars now see their heritage displayed with dignity. Where once they faced skepticism, they now see acknowledgement. Their ancestor is not only remembered, but honored, as a woman whose story speaks to the deepest truths of the American past. And yet, with recognition comes discomfort. The story forces visitors, students, and historians alike to confront uneasy questions. How do we celebrate Jefferson's words about liberty while remembering his enslavement of more than 600 people? Can we honor his contributions to democracy while acknowledging his private life with a woman who had no legal right to refuse him? To stand at Monticello is to stand at that crossroads, where ideals meet contradictions and where history demands we see both. The legacy of Sally Hemings is not just about Jefferson, it is about America itself. It reminds us that the nation was built on brilliance and bondage, on dreams and hypocrisy, on declarations of freedom penned by men who denied it to others. Her story is a mirror, reflecting back the uneasy truth that progress is always shadowed by struggle. But it is also a story of resilience. Despite the silence, despite the denials, Sally's name endured. Her children survived. Her descendants carried forward her memory even when scholars dismissed them. That endurance is itself a form of triumph, proof that the voices of the overlooked can outlast centuries of forgetting. In recent years, literature, documentaries, and museum exhibitions have carried Sally Hemings into classrooms, libraries, and living rooms across the country. She is no longer invisible. She is no longer rumor. She is history. And in that recognition lies a kind of justice. Not the justice denied her in life, but the justice of being remembered, acknowledged, and understood. The story of Jefferson and Hemings will never resolve neatly. It is too human, too tangled in power and contradiction, but perhaps that is the point. In the end, it reminds us that history is not the tale of spotless heroes, but of flawed people. People whose choices reveal both the greatness and the failures of the world they shaped. And so when we speak of Jefferson's legacy today, we must also speak of hers. Sally Hemings, once hidden in the shadows of history, now stands in the light, not as a curiosity, not as a scandal, but as a woman whose life forces America to face itself, its promises, its betrayals, and its enduring struggle to reconcile the two.
History rarely gives us simple stories. It prefers puzzles, contradictions, and tales that leave us unsettled. The story of Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings is one of those puzzles, an entanglement of love and power, of intimacy and inequality, of freedom proclaimed on parchment while denied in practice. Some look at Jefferson and Hemings and see romance, a relationship that endured across decades, producing children who would carry both names into the future. Others look and see coercion, a system that made genuine choice nearly impossible, where one person's power over another overshadowed every glance, every word, every promise. Between those poles lies a spectrum of interpretation, and perhaps the truth lingers somewhere in the murky space between. But what cannot be denied is this: their relationship shaped lives. It shaped the Hemings family, giving them a lineage tied forever to the author of the Declaration of Independence. It shaped Monticello, where whispers behind closed doors eventually grew into truth displayed in glass cases. And it shaped America's memory, forcing us to admit that the men we call founders were not simply builders of ideals, but men bound in contradictions. Sally Hemings did not leave behind letters or speeches. We do not know her voice directly, only the faint echoes pass through her children, her descendants, and her presence in the records of others. Yet silence itself can speak. It tells us of a life lived under constraint, of a woman whose story was almost erased, but who endures nonetheless. Jefferson's words declared that all men are created equal, yet his life reminds us how unevenly he believed them. That dissonance, the gap between principle and practice, is not just Jefferson's burden, it is America's. It is the same gap that haunted the 19th century, that sparked wars and rebellions, and that still lingers in debates about equality today. And so the tale of the president and the enslaved woman is not merely a private story, it is a national one.
It reminds us that liberty and bondage coexisted in the same house, that democracy and slavery were not opposite but uneasy partners in the American experiment. It reminds us that history's most celebrated figures carried secrets, and that those secrets shaped lives as surely as their public deeds did. Perhaps, in the end, the greatest legacy of Thomas Jefferson and Hemings is the way their story makes us look harder at the myths we build, the truths we avoid, and the complexity we inherit. It asks us to resist easy answers, to sit with discomfort, and to acknowledge that the past was never as simple as the stories we once told ourselves. The frontier of history is not so different from the frontier of the West. It is a place of blurred lines, of shadows and light, of justice and injustice mixed together. In Jefferson and Hemings we find all of it: tenderness and domination, intimacy and silence, memory and erasure. And so when we remember the president who wrote of freedom and the woman who lived without it, we are left with the paradox at the heart of America itself, a paradox that still whispers, still unsettles, and still asks the same timeless question: how do we reconcile the ideals we cherish with the truths we would rather forget? That is the legacy of Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings, a legacy not of tidy endings but of enduring questions. Questions that, like the shadow of Monticello at dusk, stretch long into the present day.